Dr. Baudot-Trajtenberg, Deputy Governor of the Bank of Israel, honorable members of the board, President, Rector, deans, honored guests, and distinguished faculty. Good afternoon. My name is Michal Biron, and I am the head of the General MBA program and the MBA program for non-for-profit organizations at the Department of Business Administration. I am thrilled to welcome you on this 20th anniversary. Over the years, the Department of Business Administration has grown beyond measure. With innovative programs spanning real estate, shipping, human resource management, a green MBA, and the Far East, 3,000 students have graduated our programs and are now represented in almost every strand of the Israeli economy, both commercial, nonprofit, and government. All this is part of the university's youngest faculty, the Faculty of Management. In my field, like other fields in our department, we build bridges between the academic and business world. It is exciting to be part of our students' journey where they bring their experience and live with their tools to lead business in Israel and beyond. My current research focuses on workplace relationships and the implications of such relations on individuals and organizations. I also study development, career development, and knowledge management practices. Like many of my colleagues, I wear many hats. For example, I am the chair and Israel ambassador and the ambassador program of the Academy of Management and represent Israel at the Global Young Academy. Throughout my work, I've been proud to have the support of the tremendous department we are celebrating today. Let's see some more about the department in this short film. I hope that gave you a taste of our work. To open the ceremony, it's my honor to invite the university rector, who's always been supportive of our department. Professor David Faraggi, it is my pleasure to invite you to say a few words.
Thank you very much. It's really a great pleasure and honor for me to be here to celebrate with you the 20th anniversary of the Department of Business Administration. The department started in the Faculty of Social Sciences, and I also belong to the Statistics Department, so we were partners for many years. And 20 years ago, the Council of Higher Education approved the opening of the School of Business Administration at that time to award an MBA degree. The uniqueness of the school that we see today is the wide variety of specializations in the area of business administration, like the International MBA program in English, another English program in speciality in sustainability that is also given in English, an MBA management program in non-profit organizations, a real estate MBA program and management, and also an MBA program in specializing in management and shipping and ports, which is a recently opened program within the school, and is part of the effort that we at the University of Haifa is doing in marine sciences. This is another facet that really show our interest in marine sciences as a whole, and this is the part that the MBA program in shipping and port is taking part. This program reflects the creativity and relevance, as well as the ongoing attention of the school leadership for the market needs. And indeed, the school made an impact and is based from a Faculty of Management that is now constantly grow and develop. So I wish to the department and the faculty many more achievements and successes. Thank you very much.
Professor Samuel, Yitzhak Samuel, the Dean of the Faculty of Management, is a specialist in complex organizations and an organizational consultant for many years. We are therefore able to gain much from his experience and leadership. Professor Samuel, it is a pleasure to invite you to this podium.
Mr. Tauber, Mr. Amos Shapira, Rector David Faraggi, Vice President Yariv Zoltan, guest speaker Dr. Nadine Trajtenberg, Chair of the DBA of Department of Business Administration Aviv Shoham, representatives of the Board of Governors, faculty members, students, and honorable guests. The Department of Business Administration at the University of Haifa celebrates today its 20th years of existence. When it was established, it has only 40 graduate students and one general program of study. At present, the Department of Business Administration has over 400 graduate students and entranced 7 study programs. Some of them pioneering ones in Israel, others are unique programs. The Department of Business Administration has been also growing in terms of faculty members as well as in their multiple areas of expertise, doing lots of research projects and publishing scientific articles in the best journals, not to mention the research grants. The Department of Business Administration was the first one to conduct 2 international MBA programs for foreign students taught in English. We look forward to forthcoming partnerships with universities in various countries around the world. As a new Dean of the Faculty of Management, I am very impressed by the achievements of the Department of Business Administration and former executives of the School of Management. I wish all of its academic and administrative staff to continue their successful work in the next 20 years. Congratulations.
Thank you, Professor Samuel. I hope that we, as teachers and students, can forge ahead for another 20 years to support Israel's success story. I am now happy to introduce the head of the department, Professor Aviv Shoham. As a marketing strategy and consumer behavior expert, he has been a contributing member. It is a pleasure to invite you to the stage.
Hello and welcome to all our guests. If I will go through the list of all the dignitaries in the room now, it will take forever, and you're not here to listen to me talking too much. So our dear guest, Dr. Trajtenberg, University President and Rector, Deans, whole gamut. I'm sort of most proud to see some of my ex-students in the audience, which makes me really feel good. You know, our job in academia is to create knowledge and to disseminate knowledge. Creating knowledge, I'm really very proud of the fact that our department was ranked number 45 in the world for publications in international business. This is a global world, and it's the only university in Israel ranked within that ranking system. And we've got 2 English-speaking programs. We have many other programs as well. We've gone through them in our short movie that we saw earlier, as they have been mentioned time and again by previous speakers. So we try to do a good job in creating knowledge. We've got some of the best people in management information systems, in human resource management, and the other areas of business. And we've got some of the best students. They are all over the world, all over Israel, in high-ranking jobs. A good number of the graduates of the PhD program are in academia, which makes us all very happy, of course, to see our students going in our footsteps. Anyway, it's great to see all the Board of Governors members here celebrating with us. It's a great honor, and it's a lot of fun to actually see all of you here celebrating with us. So thank you for being here, and welcome.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you, Professor Shoham. And now, it is a great privilege to introduce our guest of honor. Dr. Nadine Baudot-Trajtenberg was appointed Deputy Governor of the Bank of Israel in 2014, and among other roles, is a member of its Monetary Committee and Supervisory Council. Dr. Baudot-Trajtenberg was born in Montreal, Canada, where she earned her first degree in economics. She later obtained MA and PhD in economics from Oxford University and Harvard University, respectively. As well as banking, she has a wealth of academic experience teaching in institutions in Israel and abroad. Until recently, she was Associate Dean of the School of Economics at IDC Herzliya. It is my honor to welcome to the podium Dr. Nadine Baudot-Trajtenberg for her keynote address entitled Macroeconomic Trends and the Productivity Challenge.
Good afternoon. I know that I'm the last obstacle between here and lunch, so I'll try to make this interesting. As you can see, I slightly changed the title of the talk. Not that I'm not going to be touching on the same issues, but I always think that we often forget that demography has a great impact on economics, and economics has a great impact on demography. We've known this for a long time, certainly since Malthus wrote about it. But I thought that given the special demography of Israel, I thought I'd give you sort of an overall, share my thoughts about, if you want, this intertwined link between demography and economics, what it has meant in part for the Jews, but particularly what it is meaning today for Israel. So let me see whether I can manage this thing. Not quite. Let's see. Am I supposed to look at it here? Anybody has a sense of how this thing works? Where it should be pointing at, towards, or how? איפה המחשב? פה? You want to sit there, Roy, and you'll push on the button when I tell you? This is going to work just as well? Okay. Roy, you want to push it on? We can start with this first slide? Yeah. Okay.
Now it's working.
Now it's working. Okay. So let's see. Okay, so what I want to start with is demography of the Jewish world. It has, until this day, it has implications, and it also gives, if you want, a demographic meaning to what we think of, not only when we think of Jews, but particularly when we think of Israel. So first, what you have here is the world Jewish population starting from the year 65. That's not 1965, this is 65. 65 is not a random year pick. It's a few years before year 70, thank you, which is the year, of course, with the fall of the Second Temple. So just prior to what Jews were to become for 2,000 years, which is wandering Jews. So just before, there were over 5 million Jews, mostly, of course, in this part of the world. Now, 5 million Jews clearly explains that we were not a small people at the end of the Mediterranean. We were a very big people. And it therefore made sense, of course, for the Romans to ensure that they would win the fight if they wanted their empire to not only build, but to stick. Now, 5.3 million people at the time was about 2.5% of world population, which basically means that had we maintained this population, we would be here in this part of the world 180 million people. So again, this gives a great sense of why it made sense for the Romans to take this big fight 2,000 years ago. Note that, of course, after the fall of the Second Temple, the population diminished dramatically. And this was true 600 years later, 1,000 years later, almost 1,500 years later. It dropped to below 1 million people. The world population wasn't changing dramatically, but world Jewish population, as you can see, changed dramatically. Part of the usual explanations, as you know, is because of wars, massacres, certainly after the Great Revolt, the dispersion, and in large part, what we often tend to forget is assimilation. Not only assimilation, but with my colleague Tzvi Eckstein, who wrote a very, I think, important book, which was published a few years ago called The Chosen Few, with a historian, an Italian historian, Marista Botticelli. They explained that in part, the reason for the fast assimilation is because Jews were required, basically, to be literate. The cost to be literate on populations that were by and large peasants is an enormous cost. It doesn't make sense, in a sense, if you're a peasant, to waste time of yourself and your children and to send them to learn to read and write. And therefore, for a lot of Jews, then it made sense to assimilate, not wanting, if you want, to pay that cost. Of course, the population starts growing as the world population, of course, starts growing after the Industrial Revolution. It peaks just before the Holocaust in 1939 at about 16.5, 16.6 million Jews, drops dramatically, of course, due to the Holocaust, and picks up again, and we're now around something like 14.3 million Jews around the world. This is the world population. You can see that it starts growing after the Industrial Revolution, but while, post, if you want, just before the onset of World War II until today, world population almost tripled, while in fact world Jewish population, in fact, decreased by about 17%. Today, almost half the Jews live in Israel, and this is quite a new development compared to the previous 2,000 years. So this is the very long view of the demographic history of the Jews, and you see that economics also played a role in that demography, particularly post the Second Temple destruction until the Industrial Revolution. If we look now at Israel's composition of the population and growth, I said population is about 8.3 million, about 75% of those are Jews, and we have about 17% are Arabs, and we have all sorts of others, Christians and others. Now, wrong, okay. Another characteristic, of course, of now the Israeli population is, of course, the very large wave of immigrants which we have seen since the foundation of the state. In the first 3 years, the population almost doubled. You can see here the various waves of immigrants that came to Israel. They're split according to their region of origin in blue, basically Europe, including following the breakup of the former Soviet Union, what we call the Russian Jews. They're not all Russians, but most of them came from Russia and Ukraine. And they're in the big blue bar there that you see in the early 90s. They came, as you know, in very large number. The orange part, which is Africa, is of course mostly North Africa. We're talking about Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, and so on. The gray part, which is Asia, we're really talking about Iraq, Iran, sort of the neighborhood Asia and not the faraway Asia. So when we think of Israel, and certainly compared to OECD countries, and Israel, as you know, is part of this rich club of countries, rich countries club, the OECD, we have a very diverse, growing, and young population. So if you look, for instance, the proportion of the population which is foreign-born, we're quite high compared to our peers, which are the OECD countries, similar to Australia, New Zealand, also have very high numbers. So we're diverse when we think back in history. We're also a very young population, or if you want, growing population. And here we're outstandingly different from other OECD countries. If you look at fertility rates, remember that fertility rates, you have to be slightly above 2 in order to have a growing population, a naturally growing population. You know, there are very, very, very few OECD countries who meet that 2, that magic number of 2. In fact, only Mexico and Turkey, and they're really the poorest of the OECD countries. So basically, none of our peers have naturally growing population, and here we're outstandingly different, having a fertility rate which is close to 3.1. By the way, our fertility rate is much higher than some other countries which you might think as high fertility countries, including India. The fertility rate in Israel is substantially higher than that of India. So we're not only different from other OECD countries, we're also different from many also developing countries. So what does, if you want, this demography, what does this demography gives us or cost us? I'm looking at it now with an economic lens into this and saying, well, there's advantages to having a young, growing, diverse population, but it also presents challenges, and it certainly presents challenges for policymakers. So let me talk a bit about the advantages and about some of the challenges. First of all, in terms of advantages, well, if you have a growing population, you have sort of natural growth pushing you. You have a wind, if you want, pushing you ahead, growing. So when we look at GDP numbers, economic growth, you would expect that we should have, indeed, a GDP growth higher than, our peers of OECD countries. Youth also gives us an advantage in terms of health expenditures. As you know, a lot of health expenditures grow as we grow older. So if our pyramid of population is relatively young, then we can afford, if you want, to have lower level of health expenditures. Similarly, we have what is called a favorable dependency ratio. Dependency ratios being how many working people do you have to sustain dependence, dependence being either young children or the older pensioners population. So typically, if you have a growing country, you will have an advantage in terms of dependency ratio. And youth is, of course, very often the main source of new ideas, of new innovation, often the motor of a dynamic society. So having a young and diverse population gives us, if you want, these advantages. But it also presents us with challenges. We'll have a greater need for education spending. We need to educate, of course, all of our kids and our youth in general. The combination of a high fertility rate with, as I will show you, a high labor rate participation, I think presents unusual challenges for a modern society. Diverse societies often reflect themselves in social and economic inequality, and in Israel, as I will show you, it is very high. It also often, because of a diverse society, if that diversity does not or has not built sufficient bridges between the various groups, it often diminishes what we call now social capital. Social capital, in a sense, being, accepted norms of behavior. So it's not just the laws and the rule of law, but rather accepted rules, institutions, how we relate to one another, and particularly the amount of social trust that you have between you and the institutions of the country. And anybody who has been in business, and this is a business school event, knows how much trust is important in supporting economic and business transactions. So if we have, less social capital, it will make it more difficult to have more economic growth. So let me go over these things again. So let's look again at the advantages. I said natural growth. Indeed, if you look, This is GDP growth, annual GDP growth for the past 20, 30 years or so. If you look at the green bar, it's the advanced economies, and Israel is part of these advanced economies. So these would be the economies you can naturally think of, the European, North American economies, Australia, New Zealand. The orange bars are the developing economies. We can first and foremost, what we note, of course, is that everybody sort of was hit by the financial crisis. By the way, this graph, when I teach my students, I always tell them you're incredibly lucky to be students at this time, because what you see in graphs, nobody has seen them for the past 80 years, which is that dip there in negative territory by advanced economies. It's not something that we're used to seeing. It's not something that we have seen since the Great Depression. So you can see that advanced economies, by and large, grow, but they grow less than the developing economies, and this is particularly true since the year 2000, so for the past 15 years or so. And Israel is sort of in between. It's very much an advanced economy in terms of structure, in terms of level of economic development, but it's growing faster than the advanced economies and less than the developing economies. I mentioned that one of the advantages was a lower burden in terms of health expenditures. And here again, if you look, for instance, at public spending on health, there's also a private spending on health, but I thought I'd look at the public spending. I'm looking at it from a policy, if you want, from a policymaker perspective. And again, if you take there a number of OECD, of very representative OECD countries, you can see that Israel's spending, public spending on health expenditures, is substantially lower. That's what we see on the top part. Look, for instance, but it's true, we have a younger population. What if those countries had a similar demography than what we have? So you note that indeed, had they have exactly the same demography, they would reduce their burdens quite significantly. Here I took Japan in red as an example because it has a very different demography than we have. And you can see that not accounting for the demography, Japan is spending 3% of GDP additional on health expenditures, in part because it's wealthier, but in very large part, more than 2% of that 3%, in fact 2.3% of that, is due to the fact that they have an older pyramid. So that makes a huge difference. I mentioned the age dependency ratio as a percentage of the working age population, and there again, these are all of the OECD countries there. And again, of course, as you know, and we all know, Japan and Italy are countries that have aging profile and that are aging rapidly, and you can see that indeed their dependency ratio today is already quite high and just getting higher. Israel, on the other hand, is almost at the lower end, at the lowest end of that distribution. I mentioned that diversity is a source of dynamism, and I think it's true. And when you look at the Israeli economy or its exports, you'll see that we cover a whole bunch of sectors. And that's true, and in that sense, we're very much part of the OECD countries. Most of them have quite diversified economies, and that's very different, of course, from our neighbors, our countries in the neighborhood that have very almost, at least for the rich countries, are mostly concentrated in one industry. Now, going to, of course, the greatest, perhaps, advantage of having a young and diverse country is that we ought to be better at innovation and entrepreneurship. And it's true, when you look at the ranking of countries that have the highest level of innovation, the highest level of entrepreneurship, we stand way up there with the absolutely most innovative economies. Here again, you have countries of the OECD. If you look at the share of innovations that come from youth, you look both in terms of innovations, but particularly in terms of entrepreneurship. So first of all, you note that the two countries that have the highest bars there are the US and Israel. Not surprisingly, we know, of course, the USA being one of the most innovative country around the world. It's also a country that has still some relatively high fertility rates. But note that Israel is very much at the top end, particularly not so much with respect to entrepreneurship, but with an enormous number with respect to innovation. So these are things I'm sure you already know. This is another number that shows that. Part of our success in innovation is because we spend a lot on R&D expenditures. This again is total R&D expenditures as a percentage of GDP. This is total R&D. This is both public sector and private sector. 30 years ago, it was still true. Israel was spending a lot on R&D. It's been true for the past 30 years. But the same picture 30 years ago, part of our big blue bar there, a very large part was undertaken by the public sector, while now by far 90% of R&D is undertaken by the private sector. So there's been a major shift between public and private sector, but we still are maintaining very high level of R&D spending. And of course, universities have a very special role in this ecosystem that sustain innovation. We often talk about youth, we talk about the role of the army, we talk about money, venture capital. We often forget to talk about the very important role of institution of higher education. And here you have a graph which comes from the World Economic Forum, where on the one hand, you have the quality of scientific research, and on the other hand, you have an index of innovation. And clearly what you see is that if you want to have an innovative economy, it might be, youth certainly helps, but uneducated youth does not. And it's extremely important to have a very good and an excellent system of higher education. You have to continue to pursue excellence, not just in the commercial world, but certainly in the academic level. Now I want to talk about the challenges of having a young and diverse population. I mentioned we should be spending more on education, and indeed, when you look at the structure of government expenditures, there's lots of numbers in there. Countries spend a lot, of course, on social protection. The first column there is the OECD average, and a lot of countries spend a lot on social protection. We spend on health, on services, education, and so on. And you note that amongst these typical countries, but certainly also compared to the OECD average, we spend a lot more on education. About 16.5% of a government expenditure budget is going to be on education spending. Note, of course, that we also spend substantially more on defense, which is another challenge, which also has to do with demography, but it has to do with a lot with the geography. I will not touch on this subject today. Again, if you look at public spending on education and you compare OECD countries, and now you could spend, on public education in part very little, perhaps because you spend a lot on private education. So I took as an example a country which is fairly typical, not only in terms of GDP per head, so it has, in terms of wealth, it's almost identical to Israel, and that's Italy. Most spending is in the public sectors on education. So again, this is very similar to Israel. And if you look, so if you compare the red dot, if you want there, compared to the blue dot, what you notice that, compared to Italy, a country which is similar to us in terms of wealth, similar to us in terms of how it spends on education, we spend a lot more. And that has a lot to do with demography. We need to spend more because we have a much younger population. Now we have, and now I want to talk to perhaps one of the biggest challenges that we have, is having a very high fertility rate and high labor rate participation. Here what you have is labor rate participation of the entire workforce in Israel. you can see that, and we're the blue line over there, so by the end of 2014, by the way, we typically look at labor rate participation of people between the age of 25 and 64. What's standard in other countries is to look at between the age of 15 and 64, but because of compulsory military service, we take out a lot of our potential workforce for a number of years. So now, in order to make an appropriate comparison, we look at the 25 to 64 group. And if you look at the 25 to 64 group, by and large, we work more than the average OECD countries. They're the outstanding countries that tend to have more homogeneous populations, by the way. If you look at Sweden, are way up there. I mean, most Swedes, men or women, in fact, are in the labor force, and the Germans also are fairly high. On the other hand, countries like Turkey, Spain, are substantially below our overall labor rate of participation. So even though, and now I want to start to say, okay, so a lot of us work, but we have enormous differences between various groups with respect to labor rate participation. And here we can see this. On the left-hand side, it's the women, and on the right-hand side is the men. If you look at the women, the labor rate participation of women, again, let's look at them overall compared to the OECD average. So we have here the OECD average is in black. If we split the women of Israel into three groups, the Arab women, the ultra-Orthodox women, and basically the other Jewish non-ultra-Orthodox women. You can see that the labor rate participation of all Jewish women, whether they're ultra-Orthodox or not, are substantially higher than the average OECD labor rate of participation. And this is true despite the fact, or being accompanied by a very high fertility rate, which is a lot higher than the OECD level, and that is true both for Jewish non-Orthodox women, as it is, of course, obviously true for ultra-Orthodox women that have a very high fertility rate. So the only group, if you want, there that has a substantially lower level of labor rate participation are Arab women. Their labor rate participation is very low compared to other women in Israel, but it's not very low compared to other Arab women in the Arab world. I mean, it's one of the things that we know. The World Bank has been writing on this for the past 30 years. Labor rate participation of Arab women in the Arab world, including Arab world that we think of as, more perhaps modern, like Tunisia, their labor rate participation is still below the labor rate participation of Israeli women. It's low, but as you note, it's growing. And that's, I think, a very encouraging sign. On the right-hand side, we have the labor rate participation of men. So again, if you look at the Jewish non-ultra-Orthodox men, very high level of labor rate participation compared to OECD average. Arab men are not very different. They're slightly below the average OECD level of labor participation. What is very unusual is the ultra-Orthodox men that have a very low labor rate participation. In fact, less than half of all ultra-Orthodox Arab men work. So that's a very unusual constellation. Now, this is, and particularly the left-hand side here, is a very challenging situation to have, of women with high fertility rate and yet high labor rate participation. Now, the challenge is even larger because if you look at the type of governance support that we have, that we give, if you want, in Israel, to preschool children. And here is an index of, and this is compared to countries similar to us, so this is compared to OECD countries. So it's an index of government support for education and preschool children. So we're talking about 0 to 5. Okay, you can see that Israel gets a lot less than the average OECD countries. Now, if we look not only for the preschool children, if we look at young children, so now we look at something similar, we look at children between the age of 6 and 11. How much government support do we get for that, for education. And what you note is there we get almost nothing and extremely low compared to average OECD countries. Of course, it's a lot more expensive for us to give on education for lower children because we have lots of children. It's a lot easier for countries that are both wealthier and have fewer children to put more money on education. But this certainly presents a huge challenge for us. If we want to maintain our level of dynamism, if we want to maintain our level of innovation, that is really a propeller for the entire economy, we have to make sure that we also put money where our mouth is, and that we allow labor rate participation by both men and women to continue while maintaining high fertility rates. One of the other aspect, very challenging aspect of having these diverse societies, diverse young and growing societies, is that we have a very unequal distribution of income. The Gini is an index of dispersion, and it's being used a lot by economists to talk about the distribution of income. The higher the Gini index, the worse off you are in terms of distribution of income. And you can see that Israel is towards the high end, meaning by that we have a very unequal distribution of income. If the main reason for that unequal distribution was because we have all these high-tech guys who had great innovations and they had an IPO on the NASDAQ and became billionaires, well, we probably wouldn't be complaining so much. Our biggest problem is not so much the unequal distribution of income as it is the very high level of poverty. And here, on the left-hand side in yellow, you have the percentage of families that are living below the poverty line by various groups. And what you note is that both the ultra-Orthodox population and the Arab population have more than half of their families living below the poverty line. This is directly related to what I just mentioned to you before. If you look on the right-hand side, we have what are the labor rate participation of these two groups. In the group of the men, we note that the ultra-Orthodox men have a very low labor rate participation. On the other hand, if we look at the women, then it's the Arab women who have a very low labor rate of participation. By and large, if you have a high fertility rate and you have only one income earner in the family, chances are you'll be poor. Okay? So part of the important challenge is to bring these populations into the labor force. But of course, we need to bring them into the labor force, and we should be giving them tools so that they can join the labor force with the appropriate human capital needed. And here, this is, by the way, the demography of these groups. Today, these groups, in 1980, these groups accounted for 20% of the population. Now they account for about 30% of the population, and in 30 years from now, they will account for 50% of the population. So these large groups that are poor, in part they are poor because their labor rate participation is low. The problem is not about to disappear. In fact, the demography is making this challenge even greater. I said we need to give them tools. And here, if you look at, this is a recent research paper that was done by someone in the Bank of Israel, Eyal Argov. He looked at how much what we study, how much does it translate in terms, if you want, of earning power, in terms of human capital that the market is willing to pay for. And what you note is if you look at non-ultra-Orthodox Jews, if you study 40 years, roughly you get 14, if you study 14 years, you get 14 years worth of human capital. Indeed, the market recognizes these 14 years of studies. Similarly, if you look at the Arabs as a group, if they studied on average 11.3 years, the market is willing to pay them for the 11.3 years. If you look at the ultra-Orthodox men, they're the only group where, if they study for 17 years, the market is not willing to pay them more than 10 years. And what this signifies is that they may be very educated, and indeed they have aspect of poverty which we don't see in typically poor groups in other OECD countries, because in typical OECD countries, poor groups are often uneducated group. In the case of the ultra-Orthodox men, you note that their average years of schooling is higher than any of the other groups. It's 17, but apparently what they study doesn't have market value. And this means that if we want to integrate them into the labor force, in order to allow them not only to participate in Israeli life, we need to give them tools, and we need to perhaps adjust part of what they're studying. I'm going to skip about the housing price issue. It's a main issue, I'm sure, and I want to talk a little bit, I want to finish about social capital. I mentioned at the beginning that social capital is one of the things that increasingly in economics we discover has a lot of worth in economic growth. Countries that have a lot of, just think about, in business it's sort of obvious. I mean, if you're going to make a business transaction, you have to make a contract. If you have a lot of trust in the other side, the contract can be very small. I'm going to buy this from you, I'm going to pay you this, the other guy says that's fine, and we finish the transactions. If there's a lot of mistrust between the two sides, we're going to have, the guy's going to come with his 2 lawyers, I'm going to come with my 3 lawyers, these guys are going to be sitting at a table, for a good 2, 3, 4 months, have lots of clauses, what if he doesn't quite pay, what if this happens, what if this falls, and so on. It brings in an enormous burden to having economic transactions. And that's true for almost anything, so it's not bureaucracy, but it's a type of bureaucracy that we have to pay for. Countries that have lots of social capital manage to, if you want, to do business much better. Countries that have lots of social capital tend to be countries, first of all, that are older. These norms have developed over time. Countries that very often have developed, while they developed in their history, they also have fairly homogeneous populations. So it was fairly easy, if you want, to accept, to agree on sets of norms. We're a young country, and we're a young country where from the start, we started with a very diverse population. And we note, if you look at these 2 graphs, this only reflects the fact that perhaps we don't have enough social capital. We feel it at the political level, but we also feel it at the economic level. If you look at the percent of Jews that have a friend from a different religion, not surprisingly, you will find that have from a different religiosity by sector. So we're not talking about between religion, that in between religion is on the right-hand side. So if you look about half, 49% of people have a friend from another, religiously, if you want, intensive type of population. It's particularly true for the religious people, so think of ultra-Orthodox, and traditional people, Masorti. These, if you look, they have a very high number, or a proportion. On the other hand, if you look at the ultra-Orthodox, and you look at the secular, both of them are sort of isolated in their own world. They don't even meet, not even 40% of them have friends from another sector. So that's one of the ways you can express, if you want, this diversification, but the lack of bridges between these various groups. On the right-hand side, it's even more obvious when you look at between religions. Of course, the very small groups will tend to have friends in some of the larger group being, of course, the Jews. So it's true if you look at the Druze, they're very small numbers. The Christians or other religions, by and large, they pass the 50% line. But if you look at Jews, less than 20% have friends from someone with another religion. So again, this is I would say, one of the reflection of the lack of bridges. And these lack of bridges, we talk about it a lot. I think it's in the public discourse at the political level. It's not often, people don't realize that it has a large impact in our potential economic growth. So demography, we have a very good aspect of demography. I mentioned we're young, we're diverse, we're growing. That means we have a motor that want to change things, that want to, push progress ahead. On the other hand, we have huge challenges, in part because of our diversity has not built the bridges, and because some of our groups are not sufficiently participating in the economic life in Israel. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Nadine, for an insightful talk, suggesting some interesting ways by which our unique demographic composition might influence our economy. That concludes our ceremony. A special lunch will now be served outside the library. During lunch, our faculty's research project will continue to be on display in the Hecht Auditorium foyer. There's some amazing work and a great chance to talk to the researchers, well worth of a look. Later this afternoon, there is the new Faculty of Law building ceremony, and we'll be holding the 2 committee meetings in the Ishkol Tower. Thank you for joining us, and Betevon.